welcome. We're gonna talk about hot new features in Vue 3. Ooh, I definitely did not just copy the changelog. All right, so let's start off talking about me a little bit. Hi, my name is Alex Riviere. I am the Atlanta Vue.js co-organizer. I help organize that meetup. I am also an Enjoy the Vue co-host. Enjoy the Vue is a podcast about Vue and things that are Vue adjacent. If you like Vue and you like listening to people talk about Vue, and if you enjoy the sound of my voice, you can tune in weekly to hear me talk about Vue and the sound of my voice. I am also a senior front-end developer at Trina Design. So let's talk about Vue and Vue 3. Vue 3.0 came out in September of 2020. So it's been over a year now that Vue 3 has been officially released. We are at Vue 3 now. You still have to use the next tag to be able to get it. You can't just do npm install Vue and expect Vue 3. You kind of have to go over some hurdles still. But it has been available for over a year now. You can use it. It's okay. Some things that were introduced with Vue 3, the new reactivity system using proxy objects. There is now a new native object in JavaScript called a proxy object. It allows us to look for properties that don't exist on an object and then do something with that. This replaces the define property method that we were using previously in Vue. And so now we are going to be using proxy objects. The downside to this is that it is not compatible with Internet Explorer. There is no polyfill for this. You can't make this up in JavaScript. It really has to be like using a modern browser. So that is the one downside to this. Another new thing in Vue 3 is the composition API. Because we are leveraging these proxy objects, we now have the composition API. It allows us to use the setup method instead of having to define data and computed and methods. You simply put everything into a setup method, and there we go. I'm not going to cover this very much because there are other people who will be talking about that at this conference. Besides, this has been out for over a year at this point. It's not really a hot new feature anymore. The other thing to know about Vue 3 is that they did remove filters. If you are using filters and you want to use Vue 3, use methods. That's the short version. So those are sort of the things that came about because of Vue 3. We're going to move on. Like I said, not very hot, not very new. It's been out for a year. So let's talk about Vue 3.1. Yes, Vue 3.1 was released earlier this year in June. So June 7th, we had version 3.1. It introduced a couple of things. The big one for 3.1 that they worked on tirelessly is the new migration build. If you have a Vue 2 application and you want to migrate it to Vue 3, the migration build is a way to be able to take your existing Vue 2 application, you change which version of Vue you're using, and you bring in the @vue/compat library, and it allows you to start doing things and giving you error messages when it's like, hey, you're using a filter, stop that. Also things like, hey, you're using $$ listeners here. We don't do that anymore. We use dollar adders and on whatever, right? So there's some changes there internally that are happening if you're doing some weird things with Vue. This will give you very helpful error messages, warnings saying, hey, this is deprecated, don't do that anymore. Hey, this is a better way of doing it, don't do it like this anymore, and just sort of help you migrate things. I'm not going to go over this very much because this could be an entire talk in and of itself. The migration build, you can find more information at the docs for Vue 3 about it. It will tell you what you need to do in order to set up a project that is already using Vue 2 and move it over to Vue 3. It will tell you, here are the things that if you're doing this, it won't pick up on. For instance, there are some CSS transitions it can't pick up on that have changed. The way that CSS transitions have changed are not covered by the migration build. So they'll tell you how to find those things, how to replace them so that they're up to date. The other thing that 3.1 introduced was component level compiler options. So if you are using a build for Vue and you have a Vue component and you're like, all of my other Vue components are going to be being compiled this way, but this one, it's going to have, I need to tweak the compiler options for this component specifically. You now have the ability to do so. There is a new property on a Vue component that you specified, that is compiler options. And it has all of the options available to it that you would be able to define when you are creating an application, when you are defining your build step. All of those options are available within that component. They are compiled out, and then it is compiled in the way that you specify at the component level. Now, this has been out since June. I am still not considering this hot and new because it's been a few months at this point, right? Like, this is kind of hot, kind of new, but it's not the latest greatest, right? The latest greatest is Vue 3.2. This is where they stopped worrying about the migration build and they started worrying about what new things can we do with Vue. This came out in August. These are the hot new features of 3.2. So we have vbind in a style block. You can now use vbind inside of your style block to bind data to a property in your CSS. Ooh. I'll show you a demo of that. We also have the new V-Memo Directive. You probably don't need this, but it's cool. It's something that people have been requesting for a while, and they figured out how to make it work, and now you can use it. Effect scope. Once again, you probably don't need this. If you are using multiple computed values, watchers, watch effects, and you need to turn them all off at the same time, rather than going through and turning them off individually within a function, this is a way where you can just turn them all off at the same time. It's very handy. It's way more useful for people who are writing libraries. If you're just writing like normal Vue, you're not going to need this. Define custom element. This is a big one. This is the one that I'm super excited about because I really like custom elements. You can now use define custom element to create, you write a Vue component, and then you call it with define custom element, and now you have a custom element that doesn't need to be instantiated with a Vue application. You just use it. Ooh. Then the other big one from 3.2 is the script setup syntax. Who here has looked at Svelte, the wonderful new thing from Rich Harris that is super hot, and like you have like a script block and then you just write some HTML and it magically compiles into JavaScript? Yeah, we have a way to write Vue components like that now. So let's get into it a little bit. Let's talk about vbind. So vbind in your style block, we can now use we can define a component, and we can say, hey, here is our data here. Yeah, so we have data. It has a color. We have our style. There's some more styles further down, but I'm just putting this one here so that it's more visible, with a background color, and we're going to bind that to color. In our template, I have an input, a color input, and as I change the color input, the background changes. Ooh. Yeah, try to do that with Tailwind. Not that I'm harping on anybody who uses Tailwind. I'm totally harping on people who use Tailwind. So vbind in a style block, it injects a custom property. So if you're trying to do progressive enhancement, you will want to go ahead and define like your normal background color. Like if you don't know what CSS custom properties are in the browser, here's your fallback. And then use your vbind value. And the way that it works is that it injects a custom property into your style and then applies a style attribute to the element in which you are styling something and changes the custom property on that element. So it'll update automatically. You can find out more at this URL, and they give a couple of other examples. If you think that's cool, it's basically a replacement for having to be like colon style equals and then like writing CSS in there, right? Like this is a way to do it so that you don't have to think about it. You're just like, yeah, here's my styles, and yeah, it's gonna pull from this data in here, right? So you're able to kind of merge data around. The next one is V-Memo. So V-Memo works by only updating when the data you tell it updates. So this is weird. This is one of those things you probably don't need it. It's an optimization thing. If you know that the DOM does not need to update until this value updates, you can now tell Vue, work that way. So in this demo, I have a button that increments our count and an input that updates our message. In this area, I have it set to V-Memo count, so it will only update when count updates. And down here, I have it set to V-Memo message, and it will only update when message updates. So in this instance, if I increment count, the top one updates, bottom one does not. However, as soon as I update the message, the count also updates because it pulls in that updated state, but it only updates when the message updates. Similarly, the message in our top example has not updated. However, now if I increment the count, the message will update as well. So this is an optimization feature that you probably don't need, but when you need it, super useful, right? It is a great tool to have available. You're not going to need it probably. Like 98% of the time, not going to need it. That 2% of the time when you do need it, super handy. It basically just gives you more control over when things render. This is something I think that React has had for a while, and we've never had an equivalent in Vue, and so they figured out, oh, this is how we do it. If you're interested in this, you want to know more, you can find out more at the documentation site. It does work with v-for loops. So for instance, if you have a list of things and you want to only update when the thing updates in the list, you can do that now. Also, you probably shouldn't use this. So there you go. There's all your caveats. Effect scope. I am not going to demo this one because I don't have a good example for when you should use it. I just really don't. I'm sorry. It's used to create a local scope for things like computed, watch, and watch effect. It allows you to stop multiple effects at once. You can add multiple things to a scope in like succession. You don't have to do it all at once. You can be like, okay, I'm going to define this thing. Okay, now I'm going to add another thing in later. Now I'm going to add another thing in later. And then you can just stop them all at once, and it just works. There's also some hooks in there for getting the current scope that you're in. So if you're in, you can make a method somewhere else and then like be able to get the current scope. And there is the on-scope dispose. So if you are doing something inside of a scope, when you tell everything to stop, there is a way to clean things up if you need to clean extra things up. This is typically, once again, you probably won't use this. This is really for library developers. It's something where if you're using something and it's reusable and you want to be able to just like pop it in wherever you want to, this is going to be great for you. You can find out more, once again, at the documentation site for effect scope. And like I said, I'm not doing a demo of this one because I could not come up with a good example of when to use it. Now we're going to get to the good stuff. Define custom element. This is the one that I'm really excited about, and no one is talking about it, it feels like. So who here knows what a custom element is? Anybody? I got one hand. So who here knows what a web component is? There we go, I got some more hands. So web components are a native in-browser way to define HTML elements. They use shadow DOM and scope styles that the browser just sort of like understands, right? That is what a custom element is. When I talk about custom elements, I am talking about web components. It's sort of the thing that they were like, oh, we're gonna make web components a thing in the browser. And everybody's like, this is way too complicated to use. And they're like, yep. But it's really cool because when you define a custom element, you just type in that HTML element and it works on the page. You don't have to start a Vue application. You don't have to start a React application. You don't have to start a Svelte application. You just use it, right? So it has some different lifecycle methods, but the Vue team figured, hey, what if we make it possible to make Vue components into custom elements? So now you can. Vue components can be turned into native custom elements. You don't have to have a Vue app running to use them. This is the big one. You don't have to have a Vue app running to use them. It does still use the Vue runtime. There's like a 16, I'll get into that. There's like a 16 kilobyte overhead. But if you're doing like a design system, you can write that entire design system in Vue, then say, load this JavaScript bundle, and then just start typing HTML, and it'll work. So here's a demo of it. I am importing, and this is all within the browser, right? I am not doing a compile step on this one. This is just within the browser. I am importing define custom element from Vue 3. We have our hello world component. This is, you've seen this before, right? I got props, I got emits, which is a new Vue 3 thing. If you didn't know, you can define the events that are going to be emitted. You can actually do some like validation on those things that are being emitted. I've got my template. And define custom element does look for a styles thing that you can use to define styles that will be put into your custom element that will be scoped to that custom element. They won't bleed outside of, and nothing else will get in. And then once you've done that, because we've wrapped it in define custom element, right? So we've taken our regular Vue component that everybody knows how to write. And this is using the options you can use. You can use the composition API if you want to. That works too. Once we've done that, we're going to pass our special element to custom elements.define, which is in the browser. That is a thing that is in the browser. And we say this is the name of the tag, so hello world. I used to have it called CE-wave emoji wave emoji world, right? So that it was hello world. And in here you can see I have a slot, I have some just my template, I have like a style that changes based on a prop. And when we look at the HTML, also notice I am not starting a Vue application anywhere in here. So when we look at our HTML, you just write hello world and then put in the name that you want and it spits it out. And I can pass in props as attributes. This will work with Vue. In Vue, you need to tell it you're using a web component, basically. But if you define this component in a file, you can bring it into, it's just a Vue component, so you could just bring it in as a Vue component, right? And on the doc site, they have more information about like best practices for how to register all your Vue components as custom elements, et cetera, et cetera. But so there we go. That is define custom element. I think it's super exciting. I don't know about you, but I think that this is really great because I love web components and I love having that sort of native built-in JavaScript-y goodness. There are a couple of caveats to using this. One, you cannot use scope slots. Darn. So yeah, you're not going to be able to get data out of the view component into your slots, but slots work exactly the way that you expect them to. You can use named slots. You can use a default slot. Slots just work. Your props work. Provide and inject work. So if you want a compound component, you can do that. However, I say that provide and inject works. Provide and inject only works with other custom elements. So if you are using a web component version of a view component, it will work with other web component versions of a view component. But if you try to put that web component version of a view component inside of a view application and inject some data into it from data that is provided from the view application, or the reverse, not going to work. So that is something to be aware of. There's a boundary there that is not going to be crossed. The other thing is it has a 16 kilobyte overhead for the view system. You are still importing view. I think it imports possibly a subset. Like if you're doing the full compiler step, it still has to bring in view because you need the reactivity system. You need all the lifecycle methods. You need all of that stuff. But all in all, not that bad. You can find out more at the Vue documentation site. They have a whole guide. They have examples of how to write this. You would want to write your Vue component, import that Vue component, and then wrap it in define custom element, rather than doing define custom element within the Vue component itself. That's sort of the only thing. But then you can just register them however you want to. All right, the other big feature of Vue 3.2, how am I doing on time? Doing good. The other big feature of Vue 3.2 is script setup. You missed my Tailwind joke earlier. With script setup, you can, with the composition API, you create an object and you give it a setup method. Somebody thought, that's a lot of boilerplate. We should have a way to do this a little bit easier. So they made script setup. It's a new way to write composition API stuff. It's compile time only. This does not work in the browser. You have to do this in a Vue single file component, and it has to be compiled through the Vue compiling step. And it looks kind of like a Svelte component if you've ever used Svelte, because we no longer export default. We no longer export anything, really. You just define things and then it does stuff. If you want to know more about script setup, there's stuff here. I'm going to show you a couple of demos. So this is a composition API component. We're using a setup method. So this is without the script setup syntax. So as you see here, we're importing ref from Vue. We're going to export our default object. We have a setup method, and then we define const message equals ref, and then function do something, and then we return message and do something, right? That is how a setup function works. This is how it all sort of works. And it does the thing, right? Like it spits it out. So people were like, this is too much. There's a lot of boilerplate in there we don't need. If we're compiling, we can figure this out, right? Like we're intelligent, we can figure this out. So with script setup, you define your script tag and you add the setup attribute. At which point you can import things. So import ref from Vue.